So hi, welcome everyone. My name is Will Thomas. I'm the Executive Director of Open New York, and I'm here to welcome you to Hot Topic Thursday. Hot Topic is when members of Open New York get to talk about anything and everything pro-housing. We are joined today by two of our member leaders. Would you guys like to introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Sal Franchino, and I am in the events branch, in which we, try to find local events that our members should attend that are related to land use or housing within New York.
Hi, I'm Dylan Batcha. I'm one of the co-leaders of the Thought Leadership branch from New York. Our branch creates the content and ideas from New York. Some of the things we're working on is a monthly newsletter, social media campaign, and also informational pamphlets. We're also creating some content that outlines our positions on projects within the city. Outside of Open New York, I'm an architectural engineer who specializes in the design of building facades.
Well, great. Thank you guys so much for joining me today. We're here to talk about a very exciting topic, accessory dwelling units. So I guess just to kick it off, Dylan, can you help listeners, watchers know, what is an ADU?
Sure. So as you said, an ADU stands for an accessory dwelling unit. It's a legal term for a secondary residential unit within a lot of a larger primary home. The primary home is usually always a single family house. The things about the secondary residential unit is that it must have permanent provisions for sleeping, eating, cooking, and sanitation. And it generally has its own separate entrance. So something like a standalone single room garage wouldn't count as an ADU. Some history about ADUs: they were actually quite popular before World War II, and they were known as granny flats or in-law apartments. After World War II, they started to decline due to zoning that favored single family homes. But in the last 20 years, and especially recently during the pandemic, ADUs have started to make a comeback in response to high housing demand and prices, and a lack of land within the existing built-up environment. Interestingly, ADUs have already become legal in places such as California and Connecticut, which basically permit ADUs in all single-family zones. ADU laws in New York specifically vary by municipality, and there is a statewide effort to normalize them, but we'll be talking about that later in the seminar. So yeah, excited to keep talking about this.
Yeah. I mean, Sal, do you have anything you'd add on, sort of like the different types of ADUs?
Yeah, in terms of different types of ADUs, it really depends on, for the primary residence, like what that dwelling looks like. So if it's on like a large plot of land, you might see a detached freestanding ADU structure. That might be pretty common in Connecticut, where they have very large minimum lot size laws that result in small house on a large plot of land. You might also see attached ADUs that share maybe one or two walls with the primary residence, but is still like a semi-freestanding structure. And there's also converted garage ADUs, or even ADUs that can be above the garage as well. And we'd like to see those because, converting parking into housing is truly, truly amazing.
I think it's important. I think the beauty of the ADU is that it's flexible. You can have a basement apartment could be an ADU, a garage conversion could be an ADU, a backyard cottage could be an ADU, an attic could be an ADU. You could have an ADU within, just like, subdivided from a property. So there's a lot of, flexibility for your local homeowner, that we can bring in. I'm going to bring in a fourth guest.
Right.
We have Nicholas Wu.
Hello, Nicholas. ADUs, am I right?
Hello, Nicholas. You're just in time. We've started recording. I wanted to ask, can you explain a little bit about what prevents anyone and everyone from having their own ADU? I think Nick might be. All right.
Should I try to take that one? Because
Yeah.
I know, like, as we were discussing earlier, like in terms of the type of ADU that one can have, whether it's a basement above a garage, with detached unit in the backyard, a lot of what type of ADU can be built depends on the built environment that already exists. And so if the current types of ADU laws and regulations are out of step with what the housing types currently look like, you may not see a lot of ADUs actually get built. So, if you're in like a type of city that has a lot of, townhomes, you may not see very many detached ADUs. You might see more basement ADUs, but if those local laws don't allow basements to be converted into, legal ADU apartments, then you may not see widespread adoption. So it really depends on, the laws needing to be flexible enough to meet demand within what the built environment currently looks like.
No, and I think one thing that's important to add is, like, when you have like such a housing shortage like we have in New York, that a lot of times people will resort to these kinds of living situations anyway. That they'll even if it's illegal to convert your basement into an ADU, a lot of people will do so. And if there are many legal ways to create an ADU, like a garage conversion, or again, like backyard cottage. But if you can't make a safe ADU, and the only way to create those sorts of space needs to be hidden, you're much more likely to create an unsafe living situation, where you might have someone, as we saw with Hurricane Ida, flooding, which could prevent people from getting to an proper egress, or you could have a fire, a situation where people can't get out in the case of a fire. So it's very important to provide legal ways of creating ADUs, so that people aren't forced to in unsafe situations.
And Will, I guess the initial question you asked was why not anyone can have an ADU, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I had some internet issues, but I mean, ultimately, right? Like, a lot of our lots and people's land are zoned for just one unit, right? So as you guys discussed, it's just totally illegal to have anything else other than that one house, right? And the ADU would violate that, right? And even in many places, actually in New York State, some places even let you have an ADU, but requires that the inhabitant of the ADU has to be a relative. Other places say ADUs are technically allowed, but then they impose like a minimum size, which would be like too large to allow many people to have an ADU. Some places, municipalities impose very high fees on ADUs, right? So there are many ways in which, not everyone can just get an ADU, because, either it's completely illegal on this lot, or there are many other kind of impairments that makes it just prohibitively expensive, right? So, 15% of the land in New York City is zoned for single family or single unit housing, which means you can't have an ADU there, right? It's just entirely illegal. And if you try to build one, like, you're going to get in trouble, and like the code enforcement folks are going to come. So yeah.
So I think we've touched on this in a number of ways, but how do we think that legalizing ADUs can help the housing crisis? I'll toss it to Dylan.
Increasing housing supply is one of the best ways to reduce rents, reduce housing prices, improve access to more people to walkable cities, access to transit. Increasing supply in any ways is the way to go. And ADUs can do that. They're built in existing environments. You don't have to, keep developing out from, into the suburbs and greenfields surrounding cities. So you're able to actually place people in an environment that's already has all the resources and tools that are already built. So from that perspective, it's definitely the way to go.
Well, like I completely agree with all of those points. I think one thing, that I would add is, from my perspective, they strike me as, inherently affordable housing. Like it is like an ADU is always going to rent or like for less than a large, like the single family alternative of like having like a large lot McMansion on in the suburbs. Which is useful just in and of itself for solving the problem of high rents. But on top of that, I think that it's useful specifically for types of people that need housing flexibility. So like whether you're a senior living on a fixed income, an ADU. Renting out an ADU might allow you to pay your property tax to avoid foreclosure while staying in your community and aging in place. Whereas for if you're a kid just graduating from school, you can potentially live with in your own unit. Your parents could build one, or you could find another unit in your community where you'd be able to have a place of your own that isn't a full apartment or a 1 bedroom or 2 bedroom or what have you. Like you would be able to find a place that's halfway affordable. So I think for those populations, it's really useful.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk about retired people, because the AARP, American Association of Retired People, actually advocate for ADUs, because what they found is that many retired people want to stay in place without moving out to somewhere else. And ADUs provide that supplemental income that you talked about, while letting them still stay where they've been for many years.
Mm-hmm. Anything you would add, Sal?
Just like to go off of what Dylan said, that because it allows seniors to age in place, is that they'll also be able to maintain their current house with the cash flows provided by that ADU. So it's also a way to preserve the quality of the current housing stock as well, by being able to make sure that it gets the maintenance and investment it needs to still be safe and habitable.
Mm-hmm. So Nicholas, do you think you could get into some of the myths versus realities around ADUs? I think it'd be helpful for people to again continue to wrap their heads around it.
Yeah, I think one of the myths, and the myths and realities will be kind of reflections of each other, right? So one of the myths about ADU is about overcrowding, right? Some people truly believe that if you have ADUs, you're going to have a more kind of overcrowded neighborhood, like overcrowded housing. And I think that is largely a misconception, because what people see is, instead of one house on like a really big yard, right, they see 2 houses. So be like, oh, there are more houses, crowding. But a lot of times what's actually happening is, because of our immense housing shortage and skyrocketing rents, right, like people are often staying in housing situations that there is basically a lot more inhabitants and tenants than the housing is meant to hold. For example, that's a true overcrowding. Like like a 1-bedroom apartment that houses like 3 or 4 people, right? That is actually what's going on. So ADUs actually reduce overcrowding, because what happens is that instead of one unit that is meant for 2 people holding 4 people or 5 people, you'll actually have more units, and then each unit will hold 2 people, right? And that's actually really important, because, well, first, like overcrowding just like diminishes everybody's like quality of life and experience and use of the household amenities, et cetera. But second, it's also really important that as we saw during the COVID era, because the reason New York City had such serious COVID issues was not because it was a dense place, it's because it was an overcrowded place where there were too many people living in tight situations. And an ADU and more ADUs actually relieve that. So ADUs actually reduce overcrowding instead of increase, right? Because the people are there. It's just that we don't see, or a lot of other people who don't have these experiences don't really see how many people are in like a very small space, right? I think a second misconception that a lot of people have is, oh, ADUs, they're kind of like secondary, so the building materials are really like, not good, and it's like not safe, and that's not quite true. ADUs, there are a lot of companies that specialize in ADU production, right? They have they have good building standards, and they want to maintain good brands to do like have provide ADUs, right? And a lot of actually houses back in the day, like Sears used to sell like modular housing that people like mail to their land, and they like just put it together themselves. And that's really what ADUs are, like, a very similar feeling. It's just that they're a little more standardized, but actually, the quality control on standardized housing may be better than kind of custom built, which is what a lot of people are familiar with. And that's another reason why it's so important to legalize ADUs, right? Because a lot of times these ADUs are there and they're not subject to like code upkeep. So when you legalize ADUs and have reasonable code requirements, then you can actually ensure these ADUs are of the quality that we as a society want to decide the quality of that. So I think those are like two big myths that I've heard, and kind of the realities associated with that.
No, and I think the harm reduction point is very important to make. I think would Dylan or Sal, would you have anything you want to add there?
I think Nick, you covered exactly what was on my mind.
Nailed it. Yeah.
No, I do think there are some misconceptions that I've heard, at least as well, with regard to I think how these bills are proposed. So, for example, there was recently a bill on the state level that would have legalized ADUs on the state level on a statewide basis, provided like broad sort of a guideline in terms of how ADUs would be allowed throughout the state. I think, however, unfortunately, the state process I think did not go as well as we would have liked. Dylan, would you mind giving a little bit of backstory on that?
Sure. Yeah. So as you mentioned, there was a bill introduced in the Senate, Bill S-4547A, also known as the Accessory Homes Act. The idea, as you mentioned, was to permit ADUs statewide. Currently, ADUs are up to local jurisdictions to decide. So you have some municipalities who allow them, some who have some restrictions on it, and some who just straight up don't allow them. This bill would have permitted homeowners one ADU per lot, while still allowing municipalities the power to set reasonable standards for ADUs, such as height, landscaping, architectural review, and what the minimum and maximum size of the unit should be. And the whole idea, Governor Hochul, she framed this as a way to for families to create additional side income and to also increase housing supply. So win-win for basically everyone. But nevertheless, it was still opposed by suburban Democratic lawmakers and Republicans. So the bill actually never ended up being debated in the Senate or Assembly. By one estimate, actually, that bill would have created nearly 500,000 additional housing units by 2040 in the lower Hudson Valley, New York City, and Long Island. So the reasons that the law or the bill didn't get further progressed was some lawmakers felt that the bill would override local land use regulations. Republicans claimed that the bill would be the end of the suburbs as we know it. And then some local residents just complained that ADUs would increase congestion, there'd be more density, some of the reasons that misconceptions that Nick mentioned. Personally, I think one of the big reasons Democratic lawmakers didn't necessarily support the measure was we're in an election year this year. They're in particularly competitive races, particularly in Long Island. And so they don't want to provide ammo to NIMBYs to oppose them and back a challenger, just because NIMBYs are generally quite loud and are very supportive of maintaining the status quo. Now, even though it didn't necessarily make it this year, that ADU proposal is not necessarily dead. There are still plans by the original backers of the bill to bring it up next year. And my thoughts are that if the Democrats win a majority in the state government, it should hopefully be easier for them to pass the ADU laws with an election behind them.
And I think we can take also, apart from the experience of other states like California as well as Connecticut, which have both passed similar ADU laws to legalize them on a statewide basis. So this is possible to pass, but I think it is worth teasing out a little bit more the objections from a statewide level. New York doesn't really have a statewide basis for dealing with housing. Municipalities historically have been left on their own to develop their housing and zoning powers, and I think we've seen in New York suburbs versus even suburbs across the Hudson, a real lack of construction there, which has a number of deleterious impacts as we've gone over. But I think more and more it's becoming known that there is a role for the state in terms of nudging these municipalities to allow some amount of construction that even I think an ADU bill is a great way the state can move that forward. But I think in terms of the specific claim that it reduces, takes away from local control, I think the state has, the state decides rent regulations. The state decides whether the mayor has power over schools in New York City. The state decides speed cameras. The state decides all of these little tiny, minute things in many municipalities. The idea that the housing crisis and solving it is off limits seems crazy to me. But I don't know. Would you guys have anything you'd want to add on that note?
Yeah, and I think another important thing beyond just the fact that the question of a local control versus state control, and that is that's to some extent a value judgment question, right? Or where to allocate the power question, right? Which is, we can talk about that, right? But another thing, something the state can do that local municipalities can't do, is provide a certain degree of standardization in terms of what is legal, right? Because if you have so many municipalities and counties and they all have different rules, it's quite difficult for homeowners and people who want to set up ADUs in their backyard or in their basements or or above their garages or in their garages. It's really hard for people to figure out what's okay, and the time and resources they have to figure this out could be quite just taxing for them. And having the state set clear rules that kind of puts all the kind of local regulations within a realm of reasonable range really allows greater clarity, and that clarity will be able to allow people to feel more comfortable and find it easier to create these ADUs, which we have, as we've discussed, they're very much needed.
Yes, and I think that's a great point, because you find, for example, Long Island does have there are a number of municipalities on Long Island that allow for ADUs, although each town has its own slightly different, ADU regulation, if they're allowed at all. We find that Long Island allows, very, very, very little construction, even with those, ADU regulations. In the 2000s, there were many years where Newark in New Jersey built more housing than the entirety of Nassau County. So compare that to California, which has set, these broad, statewide rules, and in California, the cities like LA, 20% of their housing construction is now coming from ADUs that are allowed on the state level. So I think to your point, Nick, having the broad rules set statewide is very useful for actually, getting these built. So I think one final thing I think we want to touch on is just, like how, let's say I'm a New Yorker who wants to support an ADU. How can I do so? Sal, would you want to?
Right. So, I mean, most of the action in terms of legislation that can help, harmonize rules across the state is, of course, done at the state level. So if you want to be involved, I would say rather than look to your local municipality, look to your state level representatives, what your assembly member and your state senator. If there's legislation being proposed, definitely reach out to them, call or email them to let them know, hey, I support this bill and this is why. So just look to the state is what I would say.
Mm-hmm. I think there's, I think there's a common, I think that state, I think that many New Yorkers don't realize, in a sense, that the housing crisis is regional, and that that the city has an interest in making sure that the suburbs build at least a little bit of housing. And I think that in that sense, telling your state rep that you support this bill, that you want them to co-sponsor this bill, I think could go a long way in terms of getting them to co-sponsor it, in terms of getting them to realize this is a city priority. But also, if you live in the suburbs, it's very helpful for them to hear from you as well. I think there are many suburban New Yorkers would also benefit from being able to have these ADUs on their property.
Yeah, and compared to New Jersey or New York City itself, Long Island has had very, very little population growth, and yet they're getting a multi-billion-dollar investment in additional LIRR capacity. So it would be great if we could build more ADUs in Long Island to, get some riders going into the city as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to underline benefits for Long Island, I think they, many times it's people, property taxes are much higher on Long Island because they don't have, they don't have the population to, have really efficient services like New York does. So just simply having more people to pay taxes for services, would likely, make it easier for, them to have lower property taxes. But every bit helps, so to speak. But Dylan, Nicholas, would you have anything also just on how more New Yorkers can support ADUs?
Yeah, I think it's also important to get to tell other people about. I mean, after you heard this, after you've seen this video, so much about ADUs now. I think it's really important to tell other people about that this is happening, so they can also call their state legislators and even the governor, right? Because I think it's a very straightforward concept, right? It's a fairly kind of it's a fairly straightforward concept, and I think it actually is a fairly popular concept for the great majority of folks. And they just need to kind of once they hear it, most people I talk to are like, oh wow, yeah, this makes a lot of sense. So I think this is something where it's you should talk to everybody about it, and then have them have them also reach out to their representatives on the state level, because I think it really takes a lot of voices who want to voice to your political representatives for them to kind of understand that this is a priority, and this really should be a priority.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think, oh, sorry, Dylan, what were you going to say?
Oh, I was just going to say, I agree 100% with Nick. You need to you need to normalize ADUs. And I think maybe that's where some of that opposition comes from suburban residents who have never seen an ADU, and they think it's this big scary thing that's coming into town and going to change their entire landscape, when in reality it's not going to do that. I grew up in Canada. Basement dwelling units are quite common. People live in them all the time. It's quite normalized. People accept it all the time, and homes are built with basement ADUs right from the get-go. So it's just about normalizing it and getting people to understand that it's a great way to increase supply without really doing too much.
Yeah, and just to clarify on Dylan's point, I actually think it's even really a minority of suburban folks who don't like ADUs. I think actually most people would be comfortable or fine with it, and it's really just a matter of them knowing about it, knowing more about it.
Yeah.
And it's just simply that the opposing voices, even though they're often a minority, are just louder.
Yes.
And it's really important for people who like agree to realize that they should also voice their opinions as well.
Yeah. I mean, I also think it's important for people to also talk about ADUs on a city level basis. Like, I think there's a lot that New York City by itself could do to allow ADUs. There was a basement pilot program under the previous mayor to legalize basement apartments and make them safer. That never really got off the ground due to budget cuts. But there's no reason why the current mayor couldn't pick it up, lap the state. So I think it's also worth talking to your city council member or your local community board if you live in New York City, or people in the local municipality if you live outside. And I also think I would be remiss if not saying I think you should join Open New York, which is the pro housing group we're all here with today, because I think being part of the organization will give you opportunities to flag the ADU bill at once, for actions around the ADU bill, or whether that's on a citywide or statewide basis. So it's always good to be part of your local pro housing group, to say the least. So I think on that note, we've covered everything and anything around ADUs. But I think just to close out, I would say you can follow us on social media at Open New York for All on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Our website is www.opennewyork.city.